Hi, everybody in Psych 266, Abnormal Psychology. We are going to be watching a lot of videos in this class. Some you will see with me talking to you, and others, especially the reading packet, will be more like this with a screencast-o-matic video. So that's where we're going to start today with the first section of our reading packet. Psych 266. Abnormal Psychology Reading Packet 3.0 is what you want. This is available from our bookstore, and really what you're paying for is the photocopying. The reason why it's less expensive than a lot of other things you need for college, like textbooks, is because nobody's making a profit off of you other than the photocopying and whatever the bookstore charges for that. So let's get started. Section 1. My goodness, I didn't know there were so many pages here. What is abnormal? This is something a lot of people don't think about. We throw that term around quite often, but we don't really think about how is abnormal defined. We're going to talk about a few different ways, and the last one will be the best way. They all have their pros and cons, but the last one is the best one, and I'll tell you why in a few moments here. So, first of all, norm violation. What if we defined it this way? Abnormal. What you're doing just isn't normal. That's not a normal thing for you to be doing. Well, the obvious question is, who gets to decide what's normal and abnormal? I suppose we could determine that a person just isn't fitting in if they're doing something really bizarre, different, outlandish. But again, who's to decide that? So, the good thing about normal and abnormal is it does give us a benchmark of when a person is not succeeding, fitting in, living up to their potential, but those terms are so hard to define and they can be quite judgmental. So, one of the examples in this section here is a boyfriend and girlfriend holding hands at the mall. Well, most of us wouldn't think that's so abnormal, but in certain cultures it sure would be. How about style of dress? You look at these two girls, or perhaps young ladies, and maybe some people would say, oh, that's abnormal for them to dress that way. Well, not if it's part of their culture. So that is one problem with defining abnormal as you just don't fit in because you're violating a norm. Who's to decide? Is it a cultural thing? Also, norms change over time. For example, a few generations ago, as it says here, you could be kicked out of college, expelled, if you were living with someone of the opposite sex that you were not married to. That would be ridiculous these days to expel a student for that, but just a few generations ago, that could have been an expulsion. Shaking hands, that's a normal thing for people to do, especially men in American society. Well, with all of the COVID-19 stuff going on, perhaps handshaking will just not be what it used to be, huh? Who knows how long that will be a concern in American society, and if that will change handshaking forever, because that was a normal thing to do. Norm violation would be not shaking someone's hand. But who knows? These kinds of things change over time. Statistical rarity. This is another way to define normal and abnormal. What about a number score? You have a very low IQ? That would be normal. But what about good things? You have a very high IQ and you're very smart. Well, wouldn't that be abnormal too? That's a very small percentage of people. This picture here of a tall, thin woman wearing a bathing suit, well, statistically, that would be abnormal to be tall and thin as a female, just like being shorter and heavier would be. So this is still a judgmental way, even if a number score is involved. So maybe it's not somebody's opinion like norm violation, but we still have that problem of not only good things being abnormal, but the judgment coming from number scores. So, Did you know that you can get Social Security disability in part for having a low IQ? Because that means that you probably can't make enough money to support yourself? Well, if a person scores a 71, you could be rejected on the IQ test I'm talking about. But a 69? Well, then you would probably be accepted for that type of disability payment. Do you see how silly that is? Just 1 or 2 points? Sometimes statistics don't tell the whole story, and they can be judgmental too. Personal discomfort. This has to be the nicest one. The first two have the propensity for being judgmental, not this one, because personal discomfort, you get to make the decision for yourself. You feel like you're abnormal? You are. You feel like you're not abnormal? Well, you're not. Do you see the problem with this? You should. Some people don't know they have a problem when they do. Other people think they have a problem and they really don't. That's true for a few different eating disorders like anorexia. You think you're fat and you look terrible when really you're normal like everyone else. Maybe people are not the best judge of their own normality or abnormality. But you know what? We do use personal discomfort when it comes to sleep and sexual disorders. Not all of them, but if you know you're not sleeping well at night, or you know your sex life isn't what it used to be, yes, you do get to decide whether you have a problem or not. But most conditions take an expert to tell you if you have that condition. Certainly, we wouldn't want a serial killer to say, I don't have a problem, and then not have one. It takes an expert to say what the condition is most of the time. So, there's a little cartoon instead of a photograph for that one. Last one is the best one. Maladaptive. Is there evidence in your life that this is bad for you? Like the guy here in the picture, overeating? Or maybe what's bad for you is your depression, or your anger, or the amount of alcohol you consume, or that you're afraid to get on an airplane. These things are maladaptive when it's causing problems in your life. So how about alcohol? Plenty of Americans drink. In fact, the majority of Americans consume alcohol who are adults. When does it become maladaptive? Well, I would say this is an important factor. I'll underline it here, because if you're getting DUIs, you're spending most of your money on alcohol when you need it for other things, you have bad relationships with people, you're doing poorly in school or at work, yes, we would say maladaptive. This is bad for you. We have evidence that you shouldn't be this way and that you need help. Next thing, medical model. Psychology largely follows a medical model. How come? Because we look for symptoms, we diagnose the condition, and then we treat the condition. So therefore, the medical model is what it's called because it works just like medicine does. You diagnose the problem, you treat the problem, you have symptoms that mean that you do or do not have the problem, the medical model. Now, in the early 1960s, a psychiatrist, a medical doctor, was actually against this. He wrote this book, The Myth of Mental Illness, a British psychiatrist, Dr. Thomas Szasz, and here's the things I want you to know, says, or said, I guess, because he passed away a few years ago, the medical model is a problem because it creates judgment. Judgment from social norms. And also, it takes away personal responsibility from people. So what does that mean? Well, if you're feeling a little sad, lonely, upset, and a doctor tells you, you have depression, well, first of all, you might get judged for that. Who knows if that goes into your records and you don't get a job or a promotion? That can happen for real. You can have a stigma attached to you. You could be judged for it. And the second thing is, it doesn't encourage people to take responsibility. You might start acting more depressed because you have that label and not try to do anything about it. So, this is kind of a humorous quote by Dr. Thomas Szasz. In Western society, the United States, parts of Europe, places like that. If you talk to God, you're religious. That is socially acceptable. If God talks to you, well, you're schizophrenic. So he meant a little humor by that, but it's meant to prove a point, too, that there's certain things that we consider acceptable and unacceptable, and if we label it, well, then we're judging people and we're not getting them to take responsibility for their lives. And the other side of the coin, people who believe in diagnoses say, well, it can make you feel better to know that what you have actually has a name. And if we know the symptoms and we know the condition, well, then we can actually do something to treat this problem that you have. So see, this is what college is all about, critical thinking, getting you to see that there are two sides to any type of discussion. Dr. Thomas Szasz, The Myth of Mental Illness, from 1962. Now, we're just going to spend a few minutes on a 5,000-year history of abnormality. Isn't that crazy? Not to spend any more time than that? Well, how did all this happen that we started diagnosing and treating people with mental illnesses and psychological conditions? Back in prehistoric times, the caveman days, we don't know exactly what they were thinking because none of those people are alive anymore, but based on hieroglyphics and pictures they drew and things like that, this term came along, trepanning or trephination. Not sure why it has a few different spellings, but it's all the same thing. Putting a hole in someone's skull. Does that work? Well, it probably makes them less annoying because you either kill them or make them comatose by putting a hole in their skull. But what were they thinking back then? Well, what we assume they were thinking is that they were releasing evil demons from your head. Did that work? Not really. Didn't really cure anybody's mental illness. But perhaps, they weren't annoying people or harming people anymore, but still not a cure. Now we fast forward to about 400 BC, Hippocrates. He was a philosopher, but also a doctor. Back then, you could be both. Hippocrates was the first one to say, maybe the problems in your mind are related to problems in your body. Hippocrates, he's famous for the Hippocratic Oath, by the way. If any of you are going to become medical professionals, you'll take the Hippocratic Oath. I will do no harm. But he's also well known for this. He thought that there were different body humors or different fluids in your body that were different colors, and you could have too much or too little of these biles, as he called them, and they could be good or bad for you. Red was blood. You could have too much blood or too little blood, according to Hippocrates, or bad blood or good blood. Black bile was in your internal organs, especially your liver. Green bile was in your nose and in your head, like phlegm and mucus. And yellow bile was urine. So these are examples of what he thought you could have too much of, too little of, or bad or good fluids. You've probably heard about bloodletting. That is something that came from Hippocrates' medical philosophies. And this was so popular that it was even used on George Washington in the winter of 1799, and many experts believe it actually killed him. He came down with pneumonia, and they tried a bloodletting with him, and he did not survive it. So not that he was going to live forever anyway, but that probably made it worse rather than better. Witch hunts. There was a time in society of nearly 500 years, 1400s to the 1800s, anybody who was exhibiting mental illness, and depending on the severity of it, you were seen as a witch. And you probably know the tests that were used for witches. It really didn't help matters any because people who were seen as a witch, well, they would usually be killed one way or another, drowned or burned at a stake or whatever else. So this was not a good thing. Around the same time in American society and world society, especially European society, insane asylums, they would lock people up, they would chain them to walls, put them in cages if you were seen as insane. That made people worse rather than better. One of the most famous ones that still exists, but not as an insane asylum, it's now a hospital, Bethlehem, outside of London, England. Started in 1357. Those buildings were still there. For some reason, the people who worked there and the townspeople called it Bedlam, not Bethlehem. That's become a word in American society. If you say, oh, it's Bedlam out here, well, you must mean that there's craziness. That's where the term comes from. Perhaps you've heard the term but didn't know where it came from. Well, right around 1800, the late 1700s, a French politician, minister of education, Philippe Pinel, he decided that in France, the insane asylums would turn more into hospitals. I don't know how to say it in French, but his phrase was, "We will treat with dignity." Well, guess what? The patients weren't necessarily cured, but they did improve. So Pinel deserves a lot of credit for modernizing what we used to do to people who were considered insane asylums. From that came moral therapy, and this came to the United States in the early 1800s, first half of the 1800s, by a woman by the name of Dorothea Dix. She went to the state legislatures of many states. There weren't many back then, they didn't have 50 states like they did now, but she convinced them to change the model from insane asylums to mental hospitals. The fact that she was a woman doing that back then in the first half of the 1800s was absolutely amazing because, politicians didn't listen to women back then. All the politicians were men, and women didn't even have the right to vote. So she deserves a lot of credit. If you take any women's studies, women's history, you might learn about Dorothea Dix yet again. Well, we're coming to the end here of this chapter. Late 1700s and early 1800s, a guy by the name of Franz Anton Mesmer came up with hypnosis. He was not taken seriously, though, because Mesmer would put people under a spell. He would wear these lavish coats with different colored feathers on them, boil liquids, scream and chant. It was more like a circus act. It was entertainment. But people would go under his spell, and when they came out, they would feel better. And while under the spell, they would talk about things that were on their minds. Well, we fast forward most of a century, about 75 years later, Jean-Martin Charcot, also in France, he developed hypnosis, but you see the drawing here, he was a university professor. He wore a suit. He used a pocket watch rather than boiling liquids and a coat with feathers and things like that. He was taken more seriously. But you probably guessed this already. Mesmer's name is now a word, mesmerize. So that is a well-known word in the English language. Charcot is more famous for modernizing it, but Mesmer's name came into our awareness because of the word mesmerize. Well, Joseph Breuer used to bring his young student Sigmund Freud from Vienna, Austria, all the way to France to see Charcot practice. And people would go under a spell, and he would have them talk, and when they woke up, they would feel better. Breuer thought that people could talk out their problems, but needed to be hypnotized. His young student, Sigmund Freud, they were 14 years apart. Freud believed that all you needed to do was delve into your unconscious. And that's the way that you could solve your problems and deal with your issues. That led to what we call psychoanalysis and talk therapy. So see, we started with putting holes in people's heads and ended up with a process to talk through one's problems. So that is it for section 1. The next recording will be section 2 of the reading packet. After 6 sections of the reading packet, we will move on to the textbook that's needed for this class. That's it for now. Take care.